on the wrong one. Come on. There we go. Sandra Klein, present. Timothy Martinez.
Present.
Nicolette Moultrie.
Present.
Etzlin Pujol.
Present.
Chairperson's report, we had a good intro. Thanks to Noel that they tabled two of their legislative items to our licensing since it pertains to licensing. And I appreciate Tony also speaking to me ahead of time to get me well prepared for this. Item number 3, discussion and possible action and recommendation to the full board on proposal to revise Business and Professional Code Section 1930 to require RDHAPs to provide documentation of an existing relationship with a dentist at each license renewal. Anthony, Tony, you wanna?
So for this section, it basically states that the relationship for an RDHAP to have with the dentist must be reported to the board without any specifics. So the only time when we're informed of a relationship that an RDHAP has with the dentist is on the initial application. So once the application is submitted through and approved and the person is licensed, there's no ongoing requirement that we're informed of any ongoing relationship with at least one licensed dentist. So many phone calls that I've received and emails and the like from particularly licensed dentists indicate that a particular name of an RDHAP, they may have had a relationship 15 years ago, but now they're declining that they continue with that relationship and it hasn't been there for a long time. So that's concerning because obviously HAPs need to have that referring dentist. So what we wanted to do is revise the language to where HAPs would now report to us their relationship with at least one licensed dentist at each license renewal. It's a convenient way, and it's a way that we can track that there is an ongoing relationship with a licensed dentist in the interest of consumer protection. So I ask for the subcommittee's approval. Thank you.
Is there a motion?
A motion to approve? I second the motion.
Okay. Call for the question. Is there any member discussion? Any public comment? Okay, roll call. Sandra Klein, aye. Timothy Martinez.
Aye.
Nicolette Moultrie.
Aye.
And Etzlin Pujol.
Aye.
Great. Item number 4, discussion and possible action and recommendation to the full board to determine the length of time for licensees to remain on an inactive status before remediation is required to reactivate the dental hygiene license. Tony?
So this issue was brought up to address as a future agenda item. And what it is basically when a licensee places their license on an inactive status, it was under the interpretation that it could be placed on that inactive status indefinitely because there is no section that states that there's a time limit. So in regards to this, there were concerns as far as consumer protection issues of how long a licensee can remain on an inactive status. As we discussed earlier, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, and then all of a sudden come back to practice again, and the only requirement that they need to do is complete an application, pay a potential fee, and complete 25 hours of CE. Now, as you all know as practitioners, and the discussion that we had earlier, that may be detrimental to the consumer if somebody remains outside of practice for that long. So this is an issue to where it's been suggested that remediation may be required after a certain time limit. So it's for the subcommittee to discuss and present possible action to the full board. Thank you.
Discussion, Nikki?
So just to clarify, the motion is to promulgate language with the the legislative board to come up with language at a future time to support this? I'm a little confused.
Thank you. What staff is recommending is for the subcommittee to determine what a reasonable amount of time of being on an inactive status is before remediation is required for an individual to come back into practice. Because right now it's open-ended.
Can I just get clarification, inactive in the state of California or just inactive,
For California, yes.
so if they're active outside of the state of California, you'd still want to remediate them if they've been practicing in another state with an inactive California license?
No, somebody who's been practicing in another state, what we would provide is a provision for them to just submit documentation that they have been continuing to practice. Because there are a lot of individuals, unfortunately, with the cost of living here in California, that have been pursuing other licensures outside of California, but they are practicing, and so if they ever want to come back, all they would need to submit. The idea is to submit documentation similar like an LBC application where they show practicing and certain number of hours that's signed off by somebody in authority to do so.
But we have to add that language into the statute because it's not there now.
Correct.
And so we'll add that language plus consider how long a length of time someone can be inactive?
Yes.
Okay. Is that clear?
It would also take us notifying every single licensee that's on an inactive status, so that way they're made aware of what the situation is and our concern.
Is there any research on what length of time would be appropriate?
We have not had a chance to do the research on that. Hopefully, with the deliberation and discussion with the subcommittee, they can come to a conclusion that's fair and reasonable.
Should we break this into two and say at least, I don't think it's an issue for the first part as far as allowing out-of-state renewals to just have show documentation that they're presently practicing? Can we break that up and then do the second part?
Sure.
Separately?
Yeah, it can be broken up into two parts.
Okay.
I guess my question is, if we are looking at the language that was presented previously from the legislative subcommittee and the years of inactive or active status, shouldn't we be matching or at least considering that as our baseline for?
The only difference with this is when licensees place their license on an inactive status, they were under a different mindset of how they were going to approach their licensure, whereas the other one is the initial license where, for the most part, individuals are anticipating to get the license. And with the inactive license, people have family issues, they move out of state, and decide to do other things personally, and so they just don't practice. And so I think licensees who place it on an inactive status just are in a different mindset that, hey, I can just place it on an inactive. I'll continue to renew every 2 years, but until I'm ready to come back to California or ready to practice again.
So it sounds like additional research may be needed here. Do we want to table this and maybe allow the board staff to conduct further research on what may be a fair number, and then come back to the subcommittee with their recommendation?
I think that's a good recommendation, but did we want to pass the first part that out of state, if they wanted to reinstate their license in state, they would just have to provide documentation that they were practicing? Or do you want to do both of these together?
So again, I'm a little confused, and I apologize. If we are looking at what's in statute already, I guess I'm a little confused because last subcommittee had the language of the statute as to what you wanted to change. So are we just advising our staff to start creating that language and bring it back to a future meeting? Or are we actually coming up with that language now without having the documentation that was presented at the last subcommittee where we actually had the language and what we wanted to add?
Tony, do you have that language?
We haven't written anything because we're looking for recommendations from the subcommittee to be able to create the
Start doing
language
that. Okay.
as a
That's
starting point.
perfect.
Okay,
Okay, that's
thank you.
where, yes.
Okay, so we just need to make a
Thank you.
recommendation. Did you want to make a motion to recommend?
Yes, and our recommendation, I think that's the discussion. I guess I'm moving that, making a motion to approve that staff start working on that language. The first part of that is the out-of-state language. The second part is the time limit, and I'm going to propose 5 years. I'm just throwing it out there, just to get things moving in that direction.
Yeah, it'd be very simple query to see what other state practice acts do. I mean, 5 years sounds very reasonable to me. You know, I think if you start going past that, just from my own personal experience, sometimes you need to be, oil up that little squeaky engine. So, but no, I think it would be great to start looking at what's out there in other states and just sort of make a comparison. But yeah, I think that's a great recommendation.
So is that a second?
Yes.
Okay. Member discussion? Okay, public comment?
Just a question, and I guess this has to go through legal. Are there any other boards that require that there's a time limit on practice in order to activate an inactive license? So is this something that, like the medical board or the dental board, I did check with Karen, and she doesn't think the dental board has any restriction on an inactive license when you can reactivate it. So my question would be
I'd have to check other boards and bureaus'
I mean, are we
practice acts.
setting a
I assume
precedent?
there's probably at least one statute that says there's, 5-year limit to, reactivate an inactive license, but I'll have to check that. I don't know it offhand, what specific board that may be.
I just think the committee should consider, there's been a huge push in the legislature to not deny licensure based on irrelevant criteria or criteria that can be a barrier. So this would have to go through legislation. I think that you might get some real pushback from the legislature unless you really have some precedent set by someone that says that there's a reason for a 5-year limit, or that they've used that 5-year limit successfully and it hasn't been a barrier, et cetera. So you might save yourself a lot of work by, if staff would investigate whether there is any precedence being set by another board or licensing agency that actually looks at a time period.
Thank you. Any other comment? So the motion on the table is to make a staff recommendation to further research the issue on when and how reinstatement of inactive licenses, what's the time limit for inactivity to reactivate? Is that correct? Okay, call for a vote. Sandra Klein, aye. Timothy Martinez?
Aye.
Nicolette Moultrie? Aye. Edsel Pujol?
Aye.
Okay, is there any, item number 5, public comment? Is there any public comment on items not on the agenda? No? Any future agenda items? Okay, we're adjourning at 11:50.
We go to item 10, which is the presentation from the Department of Consumer Affairs Office of Professional Examination Services, or OPES, to update on the board's occupational analysis.
Good afternoon. I'm Heidi Linzer. I'm the Chief of the Office of Professional Examination Services. Thank you for having me to your board meeting. So I'm here to report on your occupational analysis that we did for registered dental hygienist and registered dental hygienist in alternative practice, which I'll abbreviate from now on because that's a mouthful. First of all, the statutes, regulations, standards, and guidelines that we use to when we're doing our work at OPES. First is Business and Professions Code 139, and that requires that all boards and bureaus who have licensure exams that must conduct an occupational analysis for each examination every 5 to 7 years. And boards need to submit a report every year indicating the status of those projects and their examination development projects. And BMP 139 also required that OPS develop an examination validation policy for DCA licensing programs. And the policy requires that all examinations that are used for licensure, whether they be state-based or national exams, they must be reviewed against testing industry standards. So those standards, the main points of those standards require that evidence of validity for the test content must be based on a thorough and explicit description of the content domain that you're trying to test, and that's what the occupational analysis is. So it's central to everything that we do is those occupational analyses. And in addition, you need to have a close link between the test content and the job content. And most importantly, actively practicing licensees must serve as subject matter experts, or SMEs as we call them, and they must be included in every step of the process. That's part of the validation. So because of the overlap between the RDH and the RDH-AP, we worked on both of those projects simultaneously. Okay, so this next slide shows what we call the cycle of examination development. It's an ongoing process. That's why it's in a circle. The first step, of course, is the occupational analysis. That's where we determine the critical entry-level tasks and knowledge that need to be mastered in order to protect the public. And the occupational analysis defines practice in terms of the most important tasks that licensees must be able to perform safely and competently, and the essential knowledge that they need for safe and effective practice at entry level. So that is the first step. The results of the occupational analysis are a detailed description of practice and an outline for developing a licensure examination. The next step is to work with subject matter experts to write test questions, review test questions, and then construct an examination and determine the passing score. And this process is the same for all licensure examinations, whether they're state-specific or national. So the occupational analysis, as I said, it provides a description of current practice, and it's also required to develop a legally defensible examination. And it can be used for other things as well. It provides, as I said, the basis for exams, but also make sure that your exam is valid by linking the examination content to critical job competencies. And it can provide the basis for legislation and policies, as I hear you guys are working on those in your committee meetings. It can make distinctions between licensing classifications, because what does the RDH do compared to the RDH-AP? And also improves transparency by providing specific examination information that candidates need to know in order to be licensed, and for legislators if they need to understand what the classification, what the people in your license classifications do. It provides that kind of detailed information for them. So here is the occupational analysis process. We started with telephone interviews and research on the profession. And we talk to people on the phone to get a basic description of what they do. We develop tasks and knowledge statements in a workshop with subject matter experts. So for this project, in April of 2019, we had a group of RDH and RDH-AP professionals with us to develop those task and knowledge statements. Then we put those together into a survey. And in the survey, licensees are asked to rate how often they perform the tasks and how important their tasks are to their work. And then they're asked to rate how important each knowledge statement is for completing those tasks. And once we're done with the survey, we analyze the data. We presented the data into another workshop of subject matter experts, and that was in July of 2019. And we develop the examination outline with the subject matter experts. So in order to conduct the survey, we sent an invitation by email. We invited 8,584 licensed RDHs to complete the survey. The final sample size that we ended up with was 1,456, and that was a 17% response rate. And that may sound low to you, but for us, that's a good number. For most professions, for most of our occupational analysis, we get between 10 and 20%, so 17% is really good. We're very happy with that. So next we are going to look at the demographics of who responded. So in order to understand the results, we want to know who was answering our survey and make sure they were representative of different levels of experience, work settings, and geographic location. And those are the things we look at to make sure that our sample is not biased. So one of the things we look at first is years licensed of the people who responded, and here's the data that we got back. And what's important to us is, as I said, that we get representation from all of these areas of the pie. And you can see that most of the respondents in this sample were from people licensed more than 16 years, but we also had sufficient responses from people licensed 0 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, and 11 to 15 years. So this, making sure that we get this kind of sample respondents from all these different areas ensures we're basing examination-related decisions on the ratings of people who are actually working in the field. And that prevents us from asking about outdated skills or infrequently used knowledge on the examination. So the next slide talks about the primary practice settings. And you can see from this that most of the respondents worked in general practice settings, but we did get some respondents from the other areas. This next demographic shows you how many RDHs had other dental-related licenses. And we developed the demographics in conjunction with the subject matter experts of things that they thought were relevant to ask. So this was one of them. You can see it's about 39% reported having an RDA license, 15% of our sample reported having an RDA-EF, and 3% reported having an RDH-AP. Next slide shows the region where the respondents were practicing, and what's important for us is that we get respondents from all areas of California. So same thing for the RDH-AP. So we did the workshop together, but we did the other things separately. So we developed a separate survey for the RDH-APs, and we have a separate report. So that invitation was sent to 507 all licensed RDH-APs. And the final sample size for data analysis was 68 or 13.4%. Also still a really good response rate for this kind of small population. With regard to years licensed, we got a nice representation. We got 41% of the respondents were licensed 0 to 5 years, and 29% 6 to 10, and 22% were licensed 11 to 15 years.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Did you select these, did you stratify?
No, it was all.
So this is who responded then?
Yes, this is who responded, yes. But we sent out to all. Okay, so primary practice setting of the respondents, most of them were, again, in general practice, but we had good representation from other areas of practice. And finally, the respondents by region. We also got people from all areas. I see there's only one from Sacramento Valley. Okay, so the next step, in the final workshop that we had in July, the purpose of that workshop was to make decisions based on evaluation of the data from the survey and the SME consensus of the people who were participating. So their job was to identify critical tasks and knowledge, confirm task and knowledge linkage, and then determine the final content area weights for the description of practice or the examination outline. So remember that RDHs were provided with a list of tasks, and they were asked to rate them in terms of frequency and importance, and that scale ranged from 0 to 5. And then we, when we analyzed the data, we developed what we call a criticality index. So for each task and knowledge. So for each respondent, we multiply the frequency times the importance rating for each task. And then we calculate the average of those values across all respondents. So in other words, both frequency and importance contribute to the criticality index. And so tasks that are very important but performed less frequently are still considered critical for entry-level practice. And tasks that are performed very frequently but considered less important are also considered critical. So both those factors are taken into account. And then for knowledge, the criticality index is simply the mean importance. And so in this workshop, the SMEs reviewed the data and looked at the ratings for all the tasks and the knowledge. They made some minor refinements to the list of tasks and knowledge, and after making those decisions, they confirmed that the task and knowledge were linked to each other. That's another requirement from our standards, that every task must be linked to a knowledge. If you're going to test on a knowledge, it must be linked to a task that is performed in practice. And then they determined the final content area weights and descriptions. So this is what we came up with for the content area weights. Now the weights, how we do the weights, we calculate the weights based on the survey data, but then we talk to the subject matter experts and say, do these make sense? Do they need to be tweaked a little? And so they typically tweak them a little bit to make sure that they make sense. So we had 6 content areas that we came up with. And remember, this is for all of practice. This is not for the California. I'm going to talk about the California exam in a minute. So this is a description of RDH practice in California. And so we have 6 content areas. We have treatment preparation. And then we had them ask them to help us write a summary of each of these areas. So this is important for any lay people reading. They might not want to read the whole report, but they can see a description of each of these areas, what goes into the job of RDH. So treatment preparation is described as this area assesses candidates' knowledge of preparing the operatory and patient for dental hygiene services. Dental hygiene treatment, we describe that as this area assesses the candidate's knowledge of completing a comprehensive oral health assessment, dental hygiene treatment planning, and dental hygiene treatment. Patient education, this measures the candidate's knowledge of educating patients regarding oral health and individualized oral hygiene instructions. Infection control, that area assesses candidates' knowledge of maintaining a safe and clean work environment and adhering to infection control protocols and standard precautions. Documentation, this area assesses candidates' knowledge of documenting patient oral health status, procedures performed, and updating patient dental records. And finally, laws, regulations, and ethics. And this area assesses candidates' knowledge of licensing requirements, professional conduct, patient confidentiality, use of telehealth methods and technology, and mandated reporting. So I know that's a lot, but that's in your report, so you can go over it in more detail. So then we took that, the final content area, which was laws, regulations, and ethics, and we parsed that into 5 additional content areas to make up the California Law and Ethics examination. So that content area was parsed into these 5 areas, which are licensing requirements, professional conduct, patient confidentiality, mandated reporting, and telehealth. And we also determined the weights for those areas.
I have a question then.
Uh-huh.
How did telehealth, since it's a very limited part of practice?
Since the amount of telehealth dentistry happening at this point is very limited, how did that end up on the law and ethics exam?
Because we put it on the survey and people rated that they were doing it and that it was important.
In the RDH?
Mm-hmm. And it's only a tiny percent, as you see, 4%.
I have a concern there.
I Heidi, just a comment. The slide up there shows something different than what we have in our handout. What you have here is practice management on number 5.
Which one? On RDH Law and Ethics?
On
There.
the law and ethics.
I think that's RDHAP is what you might be looking at.
I would think that there would be
Okay.
more likely to have the RDHAP with telehealth rather than the RDH.
I think it was people in rural areas. If you look in the reports, it'll show you, I don't have it right in front of me,
So-
but the actual tasks.
So
and
with
knowledge
there
level.
not being in the educational system at this point, a way to give everybody an equal opportunity to be educated in telehealth, how can we test for that when some of the school programs don't have that and it's not something that's readily available in the education system yet?
Okay, so one purpose of doing the occupational analysis is to get an updated picture of what people are doing in the field. And we're not going to be testing on this next week. This is going to be put out to the industry, the new examination plan. And one of the purposes of putting this information out there, the tasks and knowledges are in the report, is for educators to review that and update their programs.
Okay. The second thing that I had a little bit of a concern about is this report going out, is this being made public the way it is? I would ask that the pictures be removed that are infection control because.
This is not, sorry.
Okay,
This is
yeah,
not the
okay, because-
report. This is not the report.
Yeah,
This
because
is
the
just the PowerPoint.
pictures that are in here are not proper infection control pictures for the dental setting, so,
Gotcha.
just so you know. Thank you.
Thank you for that, yeah. Yeah, that was just for the presentation. Okay, so, Tony, you found it, okay. Okay, so telehealth, okay. So as far as RDHAP, this is the content areas that we determined for RDHAP. And they're the same content areas as the RDH, but the weights were determined to be different. And for the RDHAP California Law and Ethics, that one has practice management instead of telehealth.
I do have a question about telehealth because I am looking at the report. And it appears that the 4% for telehealth in the RDH, the associated knowledge statements, there's 3 associated knowledge statements. The first one makes sense, the knowledge of the legal and ethical requirements regarding patient records and patient confidentiality, knowledge of laws and regulations regarding maintaining physical and electronic records, that makes sense. And then there's the third one, knowledge of methods for communicating with healthcare providers using telehealth. So that constitutes the 4%. So really, it's really about communication. It's not really about telehealth.
And when we develop the task knowledge, we try to make sure that everyone is in agreement with things that need to be, like new licensing.
I guess my concern is I don't think the first 2 knowledge statements, knowledge 8 and 9, K8 and 9, really have anything to do with telehealth.
Okay.
Those would fall under HIPAA requirements.
Right. Well, and quite honestly, I'm not sure what the law says I'm thinking for law and ethics, I'm thinking ahead. What does the law say about communicating with providers of telehealth? What does the law is really kind of silent on that.
And if you have some specific questions, I would encourage you to send them to Tony, and Tony can send them to me, and I can give you some more information in writing to address any.
Well, we are representing the board, and we are the ones that are going to determine what the percentage is, right? We are the ones actually administering the exam. I mean, we appreciate what you've done, but what happens now, Tony, if the board is not in agreement with the direction that the law and ethics is going to go? Because quite honestly, telehealth is so new, and there's only one, it's only on communicating, it's not really on telehealth.
I'm in agreement with you on that, Michelle.
The other thing I want to tell you is when we write the test questions, those are written by the subject matter experts who are cognizant of the level of level of knowledge to be asked of the people in their industry. So when they're asked to write a question on a task of knowledge, we make sure that they write at a level that is necessary for entry. And that it's also reviewed by another group of practitioners to make sure that it is appropriate for licensure.
I, as a board member, am opposed to sending forward telehealth because and this is supposed to represent what we're saying needs to go out there. And I feel like with what Michelle has brought up and also with the education system that we have right now as far as telehealth is concerned, I think it would be an unfair, that 4% of the test would be unfair.
I think that where we are is a presentation of the findings. And we perhaps may disagree with the findings, but let's go through the rest of the findings.
I want to be able to comment as we go through the findings. I think that's important to be able to do.
As opposed to simply waiting until the end and then commenting, and you write notes on what you want to comment on.
If you would prefer for me to do that, I'll be happy to do that. But I think it's important to be able to discuss this. That's why we're here.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, rather than dissecting this particular one, you may have many others. So make notes of them, and then we will come back and talk about them as opposed to addressing them to them. Because I think what you've done is this, and that's the way it is, right? Now, we can then come back with our comments about it, but will there be another occupational analysis, Tony? No.
No, but we're happy to address your concerns if
Yeah.
you put them in writing, and then we'll be able to better provide an explanation.
But for us, our way of putting it in writing is discussing it here and then, forwarding it over. So we'll go ahead and proceed. And please, members, note the concerns that you have that we will bring up then afterwards.
Okay, so the next step after completing occupational analysis for your program is a review of your national examinations. So as I said earlier, the Business and Professions Code 139 requires that all national examinations that are used for California, they must be reviewed in accordance with OPS validation policy, which relies on the technical standards and guidelines for the testing industry. So the next step is so we use our occupational analysis to review the content of the national examinations. We're going to be starting that project next month. So, as I said, BMP 139 requires that all national exams be reviewed. They must meet psychometric and legal standards. They must use California practitioners when they do their occupational analysis and when they develop their examination questions. And they must be reviewed for California content. So the review essentially has three parts. We do a psychometric evaluation. We ask the SMEs to compare the national occupational analysis with the California occupational analysis. And we identify any critical entry-level content that is not assessed. Here's a more detailed description of the psychometric evaluation. We look at all these areas. We look at the occupational analysis. We review the procedures for establishing passing scores, administration and security procedures, procedures for developing the exam, use of subject matter experts, review the examination scoring and passing rates, and review information available to candidates. All of these have guidelines and in our standards. And for what OPS does in general is looking at national examinations. By definition, they test aspects of practice that apply to all states. So if there are areas of practice that vary across states, those aren't covered because that wouldn't be fair to cover in a national what is state specific. And many occupations in California have California laws, regulations, and ethics, such as yours. So those are typically not covered on a national examination, and that's why we have our California-specific examination to cover those. And when we do these OAs and then national review, our recommendations go in one of these three directions. So if the national examination assesses most of California practice, as shown in the first diagram, then we would recommend a law exam or a law and ethics examination. If the national exam assesses only a portion of California practice, then we would recommend a California-specific or supplemental examination that includes practice as well as perhaps laws and ethics. And then if, in some cases, if a national examination only assesses a small portion of California practice, then we would recommend a California examination. So that's all I have. I'd be happy to take any more questions.
I did notice that, so the knowledge statements were created by the SMEs, correct?
Well, with test specialists in conjunction with SMEs.
Because I noticed tobacco cessation counseling was not included at all. It was question number 24 under knowledge, but you didn't include it as part of practice. And I'm curious as to why, because just as an educator, since I'm the educator member of the board, I think hygienists spend more time counseling on tobacco than they would on nutrition, yet you asked about nutrition. I'm just curious how that all kind of shook out.
So, well, in general, how the process works is when we develop the survey, we try to be inclusive of everything we can. As we go through the process, some things get taken out, but also through the survey process, if things are rated very low, then the SMEs look at that data and decide things that may drop out. Now, I can't tell you for sure.
I know the question with regard to nutrition was also linked in with tobacco. So it was one question in the survey that asked about knowledge.
So we linked it together.
You linked it together,
Okay.
but you only brought out nutrition. So how did you know only to bring nutrition out and not tobacco cessation?
Like I said, these things happen in a discussion in a group of licensees, and so that was the consensus. If that's the case, then that was the consensus of the discussion. And as I said, so I will say I was in the room when this happened, but I work on a lot of programs, so I can't tell you the exact discussion that happened. However, like I said, if you send, I could look this up and talk to the facilitator who was there and find out if there was a specific, get an answer to a specific issue.
I do have a comment as well. So in the RDH Occupational Analysis on the Chapter 7 conclusion, there is an error there where the last sentence where it says results of this OA can be used to ensure that national examinations under consideration for acceptance or already accepted by the Dental Hygiene Board measure critical or content critical to optometry practice in California. So I think that should be dental hygiene practice in California.
Thank you for that. Typo. We can make a revised copy for the board too, before they put it on the website.
I just have a question regarding, although you did say that the amount of people that responded was a number that's acceptable, but for the emails you sent out, because I personally don't remember receiving an email, the emails that you sent out, do you have any type of report to show any emails were kicked back? And if so, how did you respond to that? Are the emails sent out one by one, or is it a group email that's blind, or how do you send them out?
Through SurveyMonkey. We do track that, how many were kicked out. That's what we do track that. These were email addresses that the board had on file for people.
Right, so.
But if people have, if you've opted out of receiving SurveyMonkey emails, then you wouldn't get it.
Okay, but out of all of them you sent out, none were kicked back, you're saying, I guess?
No, we do track how many are kicked back, and then but we only have the information that the board has for licensees, so some are kicked back, yes.
So I wonder if it's possible then to submit in writing to you additional information that we would like to have, which is how many emails were kicked back, further clarification on the tobacco cessation versus nutrition and how it was determined to simply have nutrition. and then the telehealth section and
Sure.
where that
we do
came.
that.
Are there others that we had a concern about right now? Any questions, comments from the public?
I was looking at, it's on page 52, where you actually, list the different law and ethics laws, regulations, the content areas, and then you have the mean frequency, mean importance, and task criticality index. And if you look at it, you have the communication. The telehealth one is way down at the bottom, 1.36, 1.8, and then 4.55. Is there a cutoff? Is there a cutoff for when you would say, well, that's obviously not something that is of importance or that's done frequently? It's not really a critical task at this point. Why would that, and based on the concerns that have come up, why would that still stay on the occupational analysis? Why would that not just drop off? I guess I'm asking, is there a threshold for where you would drop something off because it doesn't seem to fit with what hygienists are doing on a regular basis?
Yes, that's what we asked the SMEs in the final workshop to discuss.
Okay, so
Whether they think what should be cut and what should stay.
okay, so that hasn't happened yet.
No, that happened.
It has happened.
And they decided to keep it. So we rely on their judgment of what they think is important for practice.
Do we know the makeup of the SMEs, whether or not they were already HAPs, whether they're all from a rural area? Okay,
Well, you're talking about the people in the workshop.
correct.
The board, we worked with the board to get lists of licensees. I can get that for you. I know we had 8 in the first workshop. We made sure they were licensed in good standing, and yes, from various areas of
Okay.
California. Anything else?
So you had a list of all of them, then you add these SMEs that would be eligible, and then you asked if they would serve? So it was predicated on them being able to serve?
Yes.
And how much time was involved?
There were 2 two-day workshops, one in April and one in July. But there were different groups of people.
And are those subject matter experts reimbursed for their costs or paid for that
Yes.
comment?
Are you going to be speaking about the next steps? So what is the process for reviewing the National Board Dental Hygiene exam? You have to get permission from them. I mean, you're not going to be able to look at it.
We request permission, we sign a non-disclosure agreement with the national exams, and we get their permission, and they voluntarily provide information to us.
So you actually look at the exam?
We do not look at the actual
Right.
exam. We look at how they develop the exam,
Okay.
their procedures.
And you look at the content areas, obviously?
Yes.
In the guide, the candidate's guide, that
Yes.
sort of thing? And that's the same way that you're going to do it with Reb and credits as well?
Correct.
Just so, mainly just content area and how they go about, how they calibrate, their occupational analysis is, those sorts of things?
Correct.
And then why do SMEs need to be involved in that then?
To review the content, because we aren't content experts, so to look at if whatever's written on the test plan for the REB, to compare it to ours, because ours are, there's many different ways to do occupational analysis. They're often not described in the same way, so they may use different language. So we have the SME say, is this content based saying the same as this content? How much is overlapping? We don't do that ourselves. We do that with the subject matter experts.
So I have another question, just going based off of that answer. So once you have completed the review of the national examinations, if your findings hypothetically show that the national dental hygiene exam doesn't meet the standards of California, what would your hypothetical recommendation be? That we create our own California exam to, based on that one slide, to close that gap? Or would it be to eliminate that exam, just to understand?
Hypothetically, we would give the board options. And typically, we give recommendations. If we feel that a national examination needs improvement, we say that the national exam needs to do this, this, and this to better meet standards. And we would give the board that information and give the board options and recommendations for what they could do from that point.
And then does the board have to implement those recommendations, or is it the purview of the board to vote that in or not?
It's the purview of
Purview of the board.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from members of the board or members of the public?
I just want to make sure I understand. Is this occupational analysis is not going to be used for any new law and ethics exam?
It is going to be used. It's going to take a little while to be implemented. So it will be used.
Oh, I was just
when
going to
we-
say, anytime when we're doing an occupational analysis, this is where we're collecting the most up-to-date data. So we want to base the results that we find on the exam development, so that way all of the law and ethics exam questions are pertaining to current issues that are going on in the profession.
But some of our regulations and some of our statute is so new that a lot of practicing dental hygienists have no clue. A lot of practicing hygienists have no clue about ITR. A lot of practicing hygienists have no clue about new laws related to radiographs. I'm surprised they even know that we have laws about telehealth. They know the concept of telehealth, but I don't think a practicing hygienist really knows what the laws say about telehealth. So I think I have some valid concerns
Well,
about
that's
that.
what, we'll give a lot of notice that the new examination plan is going to be, when it's going to be implemented, so the educators
How
have
much
time to
direction
prepare.
can this board give to say to OPS, who we've hired to do our law and ethics, versus someone else that we could have hired? How much direction can we give to say, we feel these things are important to make sure that licentiates understand if they want to be licensed in this state?
And Michelle, this is where I have my issue too, because this is not part of the curriculum that a student would be taking unless their program is doing teledentistry. And I really think that this is going to give an advantage to one person and a disadvantage to another. And if we're not going to be giving directives on exactly what you need to educate in, then I don't think that putting teledentistry is the way to go. Even though the questions you looked at had more to do with HIPAA, this could go in a direction that I don't think is right for the consumer or for the student who is also a consumer.
Well, as I tried to say before, when the questions are written, they're written to the task of knowledge, they're written at a level that licensed practitioners say that entry-level examinees need to know. And then they're reviewed by another group of practitioners to make sure that the questions are written at the proper level. So a lot of times when there's something on the examination outline that people have concerns about, we control that by the level of question that we write about it. Should they know something about telehealth is the question.
And I don't think that our concerns are necessarily on the level that the questions are written. I think it's more on the content.
What I suggest, like we said earlier, if you can forward your concerns to me, I will definitely discuss them with Heidi and her staff and see what we can come up with as far as resolutions are concerned. But, it's something, it's the process that we have been working through, and the SMEs that we obtained to do this exam development and occupational analysis, they are individuals from the profession. So, hopefully they vet the questions and the information accordingly to what should be the standard in the profession.
And this happens periodically when an exam hasn't been updated for a long time. There's always an adjustment period for educators and for licensees to become updated with current practice and current laws when they've been used to having a test the same for a long time. So this is not special to your profession. We've been working with the dental board to update the RDA exam and the RDA EF and the dentist law and ethics exam. So it's true across all professions that people get used to an exam testing certain things, but that's the whole purpose of having an occupational analysis, is to make sure that we stay current with practice in the profession.
And on top of that, I think that's why they recruit individuals from different genres of profession, whether it's newly licensed to multiple year licensed to a veteran. That's so that way they get a full encapsulated view of what should be developed for the exams coming up.
We have another question from the public.
Were any of the SMEs educators?
No. No,
So they couldn't be educators. Because I think that's where I think the leap is coming, in the sense that I, as a practicing hygienist, might say, oh yeah, telehealth, I should probably know about telehealth. I don't know a thing about it, but maybe the student should know. And there's not that connection between what's being taught in the programs and with what's being done in practice. I can say that I think it's important to know about telehealth, whether I practice telehealth or not. And for it to be a requirement for an exam when it's not really being done, and that's why I asked about the question about the criticality. It was so low on the scoring list, way down there. That to me would indicate that the SMEs may not even really know themselves what the laws are regarding telehealth, or how important telehealth is, or if telehealth even has laws and regulations. So you're asking students questions that I think are in a way unfair, because the SMEs themselves, not being educators, would not even potentially know if telehealth is being taught in a program or taught in a school, or even being utilized. So.
And then contrary to that would be, if we had all educators there, then we would want to have it exactly the way that we have it now, because then we don't have to change a thing. When really what we want to do is make sure that we're training people properly for the profession and for the things that they actually do. It could be that consumers are asking questions about telehealth and want to do telehealth, and want to ask their practitioner if they could do that. We're talking about people that live remotely in areas of California. It takes them 3 hours to get to a practitioner. They may want to have telehealth, and therefore the practitioner is saying, well, yeah, we ought to have more information about that. We ought to have more education on that. So I don't know, but it seems to me that the lower score, on the one hand, is, boy, nobody's interested in it. But it could also be that there is interest in it, but they're reluctant to say that because they know nothing about it. So yeah, it's a really tough thing. But it seems to me that the criteria that you're using through the survey process, through the analysis, should find most of the things. But we still have some things that we have concern about. So we would address those back to the executive officer, who would then, and you've heard our comments as well.
Yes.
Nikki, were you going to say something? I thought you were going to add something.
I guess it's just that the content area of telehealth, I think, is very important as a dental hygienist in alternative practice. However, the information I think that we are still rolling out to our dental hygiene programs for initial licensure as an RDH we don't really go into telehealth. We're barely getting some of the schools have incorporated the ITR, but really that content of telehealth comes in when a RDH goes through RDHAP, because that is practiced more in that setting. Most RDHs practice in a private practice setting. Very few, I mean, as we know, public health dental hygienists are growing, which is fantastic. And again, that could lead to telehealth, but usually, at least how things are in 2019, 2020, is that the RDHAP is more likely to utilize telehealth than just an RDH. So, but I don't see that telehealth is on the law and ethics exam for the RDHAP. So it's just the practice management would seem that it would go with the RDH exam, and the telehealth questions would go to the RDHAP. So it's almost like they would flip, but that's just my opinion.
And so, Heidi, it's not a typo. It is in the right place.
I believe so. Yes, I will check.
Any other questions or comments
Yes,
from?
and I will check and see if we have some notes about I remember we had a big discussion, I was in the room, about the telehealth, and them talking about it for the future, that how long is this gonna live, this occupational analysis, so they were mindful that this would live for more than, for 5 years. So they were thinking that of the future and thought it was important.
Tony, aren't we required to do an occupational analysis every 5 years?
5 to 7 years, correct. So we were way overdue. I think we were at 9 or 10 years. if
Okay,
not
so that's
longer,
what the big change is for us then.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Heidi, I just have one question, because it seems like the board members look like RDH on the law and ethics exam have a difference of opinion on the telehealth aspect. Since it's such a low percentage, could that section be removed without having an effect on the overall analysis?
Well, it's not our process just to remove it for, we would need to have subject matter experts to discuss and before something like that could happen. Because everything that we did was in conjunction with the subject matter experts. So, but it is something we can consider, and as I said, I'll look at more information about how we came to that decision, and that's something we can have continued discussion about before we implement a new exam.
And there's another issue as far as with educators being brought up. There's a potential for kind of a conflict of interest. I mean, you as educators teach this material, and if you have access to creating the material, that could skew an advantage to all of the educators participating to teach their students, hey, I know exactly what's on the exam, so my students are going to have a better advantage than school B over here that doesn't have a participant. So that's something that we need to take into consideration as well.
Sorry, I have so many questions for you. So then if we change our law and the ethics examination and some of the questions, because I do know that just regular assessment of your questions, if there's a bad question, does it get thrown out? Is that something that you do on a regular basis through OPES, annually, or can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Well, when we would implement a new exam, we would have, we would pre-test questions typically. So we would test questions, and if they aren't functioning, we take them to a workshop and have them edit, the SMEs change it to make sure that they're functioning. So we typically don't put out questions cold. We have them go out as pre-test. So then if they don't perform, we change them. Does that answer your question?
And so if it...
So if the telehealth questions, let's say nobody knew the answer, that question would not make it to the actual exam, because during the pretest process, if it turned out it was too difficult, then it would get revised.
Or what about like a low percentage of...
Same thing, if low percentage of people got it correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I guess I have a question. So 4% of the new law and ethics exam will be on telehealth. Or, I guess that's my question, because we only have one part of our statute, 1910.5, that even has anything about telehealth.
Well,
So-
it'll be on those tasks and knowledges that are listed there, yes.
So realistically, if 4% includes 3 knowledge statements, one of which includes communicating with a telehealth provider, realistically, it wouldn't be 4% would be on telehealth. I guess maybe where the problem is you've labeled it as telehealth.
Maybe that
And
is.
I'm
Maybe that
trying
is
to
the
say,
problem.
I don't know if that's necessarily
Right.
telehealth
Okay.
from your knowledge. Do you see where I'm going with
Yes, I
that?
do.
Okay.
So that might be, maybe that's just too charged of a word to use for a content.
Well, it's just that, because if you put it in the candidates guide that 4% is going to be on telehealth, it really isn't according to your occupational analysis. It's only a third of 4%. So I try to do that in my mind, but it's a smaller percentage.
Right.
My concern as a board member is I just don't want 4% to be on telehealth, when in fact it included 2 other knowledge statements that weren't telehealth.
And what I should also mention that the current guide that's given to candidates just has law sections, and the new examination outline will be what you see there in the report. So we'll have the tasks and knowledges, so they'll know exactly what they're being tested on, not just a law section, but the actual task and knowledge.
So there'll be a task and knowledge statement and the law section.
Not the law section. Just
I have
the
a-
task and knowledge statement and a list of references.
I have a question as well, and maybe you answered this in the beginning. I think Michelle had kind of brought this up. I'm a little confused about what our role in this process is, because what seems to be happening is that you're reporting to us what you have discovered. Some people have asked some questions, and you said you'll get back to us, but we don't have final approval over this. So this is just really more of a educational presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, but we do want to address your concerns.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I guess that's where my question is. Who does have final approval? I mean, it is the Dental Hygiene Board's exam. So who, do you give the final approval, Tony?
I believe I do have that authority to approve it. And I also review the law and ethics exam. The process is that when I go into review, when the new exam comes up, I'm provided 60 questions, 10 of which are kind of test questions to see how people do on those. And if they do have issues as far as a low score is concerned, then those are rotated out or maybe revised to where it's more acceptable. And then it's retested to see if it's a passable exam question. Now, the reason for the occupational analysis is because right now we're running out of questions for the existing new exams that are coming in, so we need some new material, new information. And when I review the examination, I look at our laws just to make sure that the answers are appropriate, so that way there's pretty much a clear, distinct answer. So that way, you know, it's, even though I'm not a practitioner, I'm familiar enough with the laws that I can identify what a correct answer is in that section.
So why are we no longer giving the sections of the law that the exam's going to be about?
Okay, because OPS has changed the way we do examination outlines, and our standards require that we do the occupational analysis, and it's a public document, and so candidates need to be given the tasks and knowledge that they're tested on.
But why can't they, in addition, have the sections?
Well, they'll have a list of references. We just feel that's too much. The sections can change. We've had issues where they've changed. It gives us a lot more flexibility with regard to writing better questions when we use tasks and knowledges as opposed to law sections. It's supposed to be a licensure exam, even for laws and regs, is supposed to be an application of those laws, not a memorization. So we're going to work on developing new questions that are applications as much as possible. So having the tasks and knowledges helps people study better than having just law sections.
But it's confusing for people. I mean, do we need, in other words, there's so many sections of the law, and some of these task and knowledge statements are broad and cover, I can think of 5 different sections of the Practice Act, and I know the Practice Act pretty well, that knowledge statement could cover. I don't know, I just don't know if that's fair.
So presumably, all the sections would be referenced at the bottom.
Presumably, yeah. That just almost makes it impossible, because it doesn't really truly obviously represent the occupational analysis.
And in my experience in reviewing the exam, I mean, there is just honestly a clear-cut choice answer on the exam. It's a multiple choice exam, and in looking at it, I mean, it's pretty clear-cut on, in my opinion, as far as what the answer is. So,
In honesty, Tony, you have to know the laws in order to pass this exam. And having a knowledge statement doesn't necessarily know where you can go and find it in the Practice Act. And for me, I'm a fan of everybody getting 100% and having a forced exam like other states do, where they get 100% so that we know that everybody really truly understands. I know that's not an option for us, but in short of that, we should at least give them the sections so that they can thoroughly understand that knowledge statement goes with this particular section. Because quite honestly, some of these knowledge statements goes with 4 or 5 or 6 sections. It doesn't even make sense from an administering an exam to me. But maybe I'm the only one that looks at it that way.
We've changed it for other programs, and we really haven't had any big change in comments from candidates. And we've changed it for the RDA, from it used to be code sections, and now it's task and knowledge.
Michelle, you're not the only one. I agree with you on that.
And while it's not really worth saying from my perspective, whether if you have the reference there, you don't need to have it actually in print right next to it. You just go to the law book, and you look for it, and it's the same thing. But nonetheless, I think the issue is that we have expressed a great deal of concerns, and this could be something that our executive officer reviews and approves and not come back to us, but it appears as though there's enough concern that's been expressed by the board that it would be a good idea to have come back to our board for a second discussion after they've reviewed our concerns and come back with their responses. Does that seem to be acceptable to the members?
So, just to clarify, you want us to send something in to Tony regarding our concerns in writing?
Or do you already have everything?
I have several questions, but I don't mind redundancy, so please submit them to me, and I can compile them and then review them.
Seek the answers, and then we have another meeting where we discuss the responses. Is that what the pleasure of the board is? Because we have some time here, right? I mean, we've been 9 years into this, so and
Yes.
we want to make sure we do it right. So
We have a lot of work to do to write new questions.
yes. But meanwhile, you can write some questions based on where we already are. We have a number of things we didn't talk about.
Everything except telehealth, right? Okay, got it.
Well, and tobacco cessation, and yeah.
I just have a very basic question. How many subject matter experts do you employ in this?
Well, we had 2 workshops. I believe they both had, I know the first one had 8, probably the second one, I can't remember, 8.
I think it was 6.
So it's 6?
I think it was 6 or 8.
6
I
or
believe. Yeah.
And so now when you go back with these subject matter experts for the questions, will they be the same ones?
No, I mean,
Okay.
they may be asked to participate again, but we try to reach out to a wider pool.
I think that would be a good idea. No? All right.
I actually just have one more comment. I just want to thank Heidi for all the work that she's done. She really helped us out. Her staff came to me and, inquired about our occupational analysis, and it was the time when we were really thin on staff. And so she offered for her staff to help recruit and bring in our SMEs, and I just really want to thank you for that. Really appreciate that.
And your SMEs were wonderful to work with, I'll say that.
Thank you for all that
Okay.
you've done. Yeah. And we look forward to seeing you again, I guess.
Okay.
We will now move on to item 11 of the agenda, which is the presentation report from the Western Regional Examining Board. Reb. And are you still going to need some time to set up?
Let's just see how this works.
Right.
We'll cross our fingers.
Because she may, at which point we may have a bio break.
We'll see if this is compatible.
Still got signals. All right, we need to make sure things type.
I think it should be up, is it not?
Oh, it's good. Yeah, it's white tape on this end. That way, so they can't kick it out if they want.
I don't know. How do you get it to get?
Why don't we go ahead and take a 5-minute break?
Let's do that.
We will be back, and then it's less nerve-wracking for those people that are working on it. So we'll return.
Afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to present an update for you. I appreciate that. If you have any really specific questions about statistics, I am probably not the person to answer those. So, as we've done in the past, when you do have questions really more specifically psychometrically related, I will relay those back to Sharon, our psychometrician, and we'll certainly get an answer for you, okay? These are currently the sites that we will be hosting in California in 2020. So Reb does have a large presence here in California, and we do appreciate that as well. There's different ways when we talk about percentages and passing percentages. 97 is not always a 97. So we look at what I'm going to present to you is there's different ones by all attempts. I'm going to talk about individuals, end of season, by first attempts versus retakes, and then by individuals over time. So there's a lot of different ways that we try to look at it to make sure that the results are valid. To be specific, we all candidates to this date, we've tested 1,745, 1,639 individual candidates. When we talk about attempts, those are attempts that those people have come back and taken the exam an additional time or 2 times. In California, we have to date 470 candidates that we've tested. Individual candidates have been 435. So Tony wanted me to kind of specifically gear it towards California. So, but I think to get a good reading of where you are in relation to other candidates as a whole, we tried to do this side by side. So this is from 2017 year to date to 2019. And if you look at individuals by the end of the season, they're very successful, 99.8% pass. And we do expect a high percentage rate. They should be trained, they should be qualified, and by the time they take the examination, they should be able to pass. If you look at by all attempts, that is a little bit less because we would expect that because those are all the people that are encompassing, not just the ones that are their first attempts on taking the examination. There's very few that really end up taking the examination 3 and 4 different times. Not to say that that doesn't happen, but overall in general, they're very successful because like I said, they should be qualified and they should be able to pass on that first or second attempt. Generally, on the first attempt, if they are not successful, you know, sometimes they just have a bad day. And they should be able to come back on that second attempt and be able to pass. I like to show this because standardization and calibration is a very important part of testing. You don't want to have a group of examiners that get to the examination and are not calibrated. That wouldn't be fair for the candidates. It wouldn't be fair as you go from site to site to make sure that all those tests are the same no matter where you administer the test. So this is the performance of all of our examiners, 90 examiners, and as you can see, they perform after standardization and calibration at a very high percentage. So this is good. So I want to show you this to tell you that our examiners are calibrated, and we do track this and take this very seriously if somebody is not calibrated as well. So these are all individual dots. We look at probing, we look at recession, calculus detection and removal, and then also the periodontal assessment. So this encompasses all of the sections of the examination across the board. So examiners have to fall into a region of 10 to a -10, and that's the region or the established percentage that our psychometrician has determined that people are calibrated in. So you don't want somebody who's really extremely harsh, and you don't want somebody who's extremely lenient. But you're going to have a broad spectrum. But as long as they fall between the 10 and the -10, then we can be assured that they're within that range and they're not being too harsh or too lenient. But having said that, you don't want a group of harsh people and at one exam site and a bunch of lenient people at another exam site. So we take great care in putting our examination teams together and make sure that they're very balanced and that we have people who may be more harsh and there'll be people that are maybe more lenient, so it will be more fair for the candidate. So we look at this every year and we look at it after each examination as well. So here is the site-based statistics. So we're looking at the sites where we examine, and if you look at the bottom where the agreement, harsh and lenient, you can see that those overlap really pretty well. And that's what we're showing you, is that we're not having extremes where one person is very, very harsh and one person is very lenient, or the teams aren't balanced. So they're actually matching very well, and this is what we want to see. And then here, it's just the pool-based statistics again, and those exam sites, fortunately, fall right in the middle. So they're not leaning, more towards harsh, and they're not leaning more towards lenient. So this is real nice to see that they all fit right in the middle of that balance. So this is candidate performance by all attempts, 93%. If you look at for year to date, we went from 2016 to 2019, and fewer candidates are really not successful. We're finding they're not successful in the patient qualification process. So in the past, our qualification process was a little more difficult, and the point was not to try to get them through the process of qualifying their patient. The point was to try to see them demonstrate their skills in a clinical setting. So we looked at that and we kind of revised that a little bit in what we were doing as far as our qualification process, and actually it got better. So we don't want to have that a big hindrance. We want to have criteria that they have to adhere to make sure that those patients get through, and they're all, pretty standardized in what we're accepting. There were only 7 in 2018 that weren't accepted and 22 in 2019. So they were a little bit higher in 2019. And that actually was one particular school, which kind of can skew the results a little bit too. And candidates are not failing due to radiographic penalties, so we took that away as well. 6 candidates would not have passed if we did have an X-ray penalty as well. So we did remove that. Not that X-rays are not an important part of the clinical examination, we're just not scoring them. So here's another graph just to look at. So if we look at 2016 through 2019 by first attempts, and again, we just look at first attempts, and that could be everyone. So again, it's a really high percentage. But then as you look at retakes, people are just not as successful if they take it the second and or the third and the fourth time. So when you look at all retakes as a whole, that number goes down because we're looking at all retakes, first, second, third, fourth attempts.
For the retakes, is that the next day or the next cycle, or what is that?
Most of them are on-site retakes, but they're not all. Some could be conventional retakes as well, where they go to another site. So generally we look at 7 years of hygiene data, and we've tested over 12,000 individual candidates, over 13,000 examination attempts. And then if you look at it as a whole over that period of time, 90% were, all attempts were successful. Eventually they will pass. And if you look at individual candidates passed, it's 98.6%. So again, a high percentage of passing. So here is a graph just to show you who didn't get to play and who did play. So in pre-2018, before we changed our criteria, about 15 to 20% of all submissions were not accepted. So that's when we had to go back and kind of look at what is this? Is the process too hard? Is it too difficult that we're requiring these type of patients or the type of calculus? So 2018, 5%, and then it went up a little bit higher in 2019 that were not able to, their submission was not accepted.
Did anything change, Kelly? I mean, it's almost double.
One of the schools, in particular, yes.
One outlier.
Yeah, and it really does make a difference, yeah. So here's another way just to look at this, just a pie chart, if you're a pie chart person. And you look at, so in 2018 it was 91.1%, and then it did go down, but they were accepted on their second present, in 2019, they were accepted on their second submission more, and then very few, 1.3%, were able, that had no submission accepted at all. And that's generally for, maybe they're not organized, they just don't understand the process. Numerous things can happen. And here's just another way to look at that. If you kind of look at all candidates, which are dark, and then California candidates, which are smaller, which did better, actually, are in the lighter orange color. So you can kind of see a variation where we are, overall, and then where your state is as well. And then here again, just a different way to look at it. 1.1% of California candidates, or 1.3%, no, 1.1, yeah, percent did not have an accepted submission, and then all the other candidates overall, it was 1.3. So still very close. As you're aware, for the educators on the board, we have a periodontal assessment question, and some of these questions are scored as correct, incorrect, or partially correct as well. So I just want you to look at, we talk about mobility. They have to determine the radiographic bone loss is present, and then whether there's bone loss, and then if there is, if it's horizontal or vertical, and then the classification of furcation, and then the classification severity of disease. So the first year, 2 years ago, when we had the severity of disease question on there, that did not perform as well overall. And I think I showed you a slide looking at all the states in particular with that. So we have a second year under where we're testing this, and it's getting better. Schools are doing better teaching it, and I think the candidates understand it a little bit better as well. So the percentage of that on that question is getting a little bit better. So here is just California only, if you look at this. And so if we look at that furcation question, 87% of candidates get that right. Mobility question, that's very high, 97%. And then the bone loss is 79%, and the 11.2 is partially correct. So maybe what they identified was they only said that there was bone loss on the horizontal bone loss, and they also had vertical bone loss. So they got partially correct for that. And then the classification of disease question was 94%. And then when you look at the EIE, which is our extra-oral examination, they do really, really well on that as well. So overall doing well. We'd like to see the classification of disease a little bit higher, but it's getting higher.
When will you be changing to the new?
We're going to do next year. So we're going to have a different where we're going to ask in 2020. Yeah. And we'll let that, all the educators and the schools know about that as well. So actually what we're going to do is just change the last question, number 4, and it's going to be more of a staging, and it won't be, and so they'll just have to stage the severity of the disease. And here it is just side by side, so you can see how other candidates performed against the state of California. And if you look at, I think everybody's doing just about the same, which is really good to see again, as far as percentages and where we are with correct, partially correct. And in 2019, there were no, the patient submission rejections, so 96.5% did not have any penalties. So in other words, their patients were accepted. 38 had one that were their first rejection. Their patient submission was not accepted, and then it goes down from there. And then in 2019, again, there were 58% or 58 candidates that their first submission was not accepted. And here again is the submission rejection penalties, and we look at California versus all candidates. California is the lighter color, 91% for that, and then everyone, I think the other one is 93, but not really a significant difference at all. And then when you look at from 2018, it was 96%, so yeah, it did go down a little bit in 2019. Late checkout penalties, you know, this is hard to, you try to tell them to get there on time, and I sure, you know, and for whatever reason, things happen. But there was quite a few late penalties in 2019. So there were 71 candidates that lost points, either 1 to 5 points, for late penalties as well. But 16, you know, 1,667 were able to get their patient there on time. So we try to stress that, but, you know, things happen. And then again, here's just a graph for your information. Late penalties in 2018, 2019, and looking at California versus the other states and how they're doing as well. Again, still really not significant differences as well as that. California is a little bit less on that one per side. Yeah, compared all, and then California is a little bit less. Tissue trauma is another aspect of our examination that we look at. 97.8% of candidates did not have any tissue trauma, which was great. In 2019, that was even less. So there were 20% or 20 candidates that did have one area of tissue trauma as well. So this is really reassuring and a nice thing to see. We want to have qualified patients or candidates out there able to perform without causing trauma. So this is good. And then here again, just as a bar graph, just to look at the differences in percentages, and they're still really close. Students overall, candidates overall are doing very, very well as far as not causing a lot of tissue trauma. We're not having to, assign a lot of penalties for that. And then I've asked this or, kind of suggested this in the past, but if you become a member of REB as a state board, you will get a lot of information about particular schools, school performance, pass-fail results, as far as attempts and that type of thing. A lot of information that I can't present to you as a board. So I know you're always interested in trying to track candidates and, where they are going and their percentages and how they do overall. So I just want to put that out there that we would be able to provide a lot more information to you as far as for a board to make decisions if you needed to.
How much is membership?
What?
There's a fee to join?
No,
to be a member?
there's not a fee.
I do have a question. Has the rules changed since when we first looked at that, as far as who sits on the board of directors?
Our structure
Would we be
has
recognized as our own board versus under the dental board?
No, you would be recognized as your own board. So the structure has changed, Michelle, yeah. We would just ask that someone from the board sits on our hygiene exam review board as a voting member, and that's what would be, and then.
Would we be a voting member on the board of directors?
If you were appointed to the board, our structure isn't like that. The board of directors is made up of combination of a dental hygiene director at large, and then a member at large for a hygiene voting member as well, and then other dentists that are in the same position as well. So yes, you would be.
So there's not a member state on each
no,
member
there's
state's
not really specific member of states on our board of directors. Yes.
I have a question, and that is, the examiners that have been determined to be too harsh or too lenient, are they aware of where they've been assessed?
Yes, so after every examination, they get a printout of where they are and their statistics based on where they are as a pool, in the pool based, and then where they are individually with that team. So if there's somebody who has, who is really out of line and an outlier, then we'll either contact that person or we'll remediate that person. So yes, they're made aware of that as well.
So that could actually be an incentive for them. If a person is too harsh, they know they might be sayonara the next time, so that might be an incentive for them to be too lenient.
We don't really see that happening like that. They're more concerned with trying to do the right thing, and we don't see a big swing like all of a sudden they're harsh and then they go to being too lenient. It gradually happens where they usually end up in the middle. So, and not to say that there's some individual that might be like that, but generally it doesn't work like that.
So I know that we saw the slides on the screen, but is it possible to have the report that you have in writing that we can have?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with that at all.
And then
I did want to tell you too, we do have 8 educators from the state of California that we do have examining, so we would like that.
To follow up on Sandy's question, and this is to Tony, what is involved in us becoming a state recognized board, and has that been considered in the past, and what are we talking about in the way of cost, value?
I have received the applications from REB in the past. It's something that my experience and knowledge on it is that there was some controversial issue as far as becoming a board member with REB. So it's something that, I can definitely contact your representation to see what the details are and then present it back to the board to see if that's the direction they want to go in.
Yeah, I think there was some misunderstanding too, maybe that they didn't have a voting, you were not able to vote on there. And our structure is such that they would sit on the Hygiene Exam Review Committee as a separate state board representing the state of California, and you would have your own vote. And then you would also be involved in the examination process as well. So when we bring changes or anything like that, you have a say in that as well. So that's been a pretty simple process now as far as that. And then since we already have, it's nice if you sit on the board to see what the examination really is like. So you might want to invite, you know, a member of the board to observe or become an examiner, so you have more knowledge about the actual administration of the exam. But I know you have educators here on the board that are very familiar with the REB exam, so that might not be necessary. But it would just be having you more involved in the exam process itself, which I think is important.
So is there any objection from members of the board for the executive officer pursuing that, or do you want to just let it go?
I think that now that this has changed from when we had a long discussion about this in the past, because we weren't going to be representing ourselves, I think since this has changed, I think that it's important for us to be part of that.
So hearing no objection, then I'll ask you to look at that and then report back to us.
Okay, will do. Just one question. I know you invite board members to review examinations. Does that include EOs?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. And then also, when we do have our hygiene exam review committee, that is all paid for by REB, so that's not an expense that's occurred by the board. Okay. Any other questions?
Any other questions from members of the public? No.
I just wanted to say, Kelly, that I appreciated seeing the California statistics pulled out. It was nice to see that. It would be nice also, and I don't know if it's even possible, a lot of us in education look at first-time pass rate. In other words, we don't look at the total, we look at I'm always asked, what is your first-time pass rate?
Mm-hmm.
It'd be nice to, I don't know if it's possible, but it would be nice to see those stats.
I
Because
think
you've blended them together in California.
And I think that's something that as a board you could see that, and you could see that breakdown from schools, individual schools, as well too. So I could find out more, you know, exactly, but I know you could get a lot more information about that too.
So that would be confidential? That would be confidential information that we would have to have as a closed session, part of a closed session?
Yes, it's not something that we want to share with the public.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Well, I'm not talking about an individual school's first-time pass rate.
You're just saying,
Cumulative, you could look at California and tell us what the first-time pass rate is for California just all together. It would be
Yes.
nice to know that.
yeah.
I mean, I know what our first-time pass rate is,
Yeah.
so.
And what percentage of licensees take the REB versus the credits?
You know, I don't know that information offhand.
We should be able to run a report through our computer system and see if it's available, and then I can let you know.
80%, 2%, doesn't have to be.
I don't see the statistics on that, so it's something where, you know, running the report would be the simplest, because we get applications from both and from out of state and stuff like that, so it's hard to judge.
How far back are you talking as far as running the reports of, just from the time that we started accepting REB?
Can just be, yeah, anecdotal.
Could be yearly.
Okay.
It's just curiosity.
Well, you know, you could look at 470 of your candidates took a REB. How many actually apply for a license in the state of California? You know, it would be pretty easy, probably, like Tony was saying, to find out that.
So 470 was last year, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's this year, and then,
2019.
yeah, today.
But of the 470, some of them could have not been a graduate. They could have been somebody from out of state coming, right?
True.
True.
So it's not, I
Yeah,
mean, it's
that's
close,
true.
but it might not be exact.
Yeah, it's probably not going to be exact.
And is the cost of each of the Are they comparable to take the?
I think they're pretty comparable. Reb is a little less expensive, but they're comparable. Mhm.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Question or?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Lisa Kamibayashi from West Los Angeles College. So 99.8%, 98.8% are passing after how many attempts, but they are passing. That means what we as educator in California are doing really great job here, right? So is this exam really necessary to identify 1.2% of people who are not doing well? And students are paying $1,200 per test taking. There are students who is coming from low socioeconomic status, cannot afford to take the exam right after they graduate. And I have a little concern with this. To the board.
And I respect what you're saying, but I have a real concern because I'm part of the Department of Consumer Affairs. So my number one job as a board member is to look at keeping the consumer safe. So if 1.2% are out there and not able to do the job, I want to be able to identify that 1.2%.
And I think it's a valid question. But it's always, I think, really important to have an independent third-party evaluation. And because some of those people do get through, and so, yes, I think that's a very good point, Noelle, because when you see those 1 to 2% in an examination that clearly have not the skills and should not be practicing on the public, yeah, I think it's worthwhile.
I do think by having the first-time pass rate, it would give us a clearer picture of how we're doing in California, if we could somehow get that first-time pass rate statistic where you just, as opposed to lumping in the second and third times.
I think Sharon would, and I'm just speaking for Sharon, but I think you'd have to look at the first and second, because sometimes people just have a bad day, and that's not always reflective. But I think she could break it down to any way that you probably needed to have it, Michelle.
I think the other thing too is that rate also is someone who couldn't get their patient qualified the first time, failed, and then had a backup for the second. So that would need to be pulled out as well to really truly find out what is that first time pass rate.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments from the public or from members? Hearing none, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
And that takes us on to item number 12 on the agenda for today, which is the presentation and report from the Central Regional Dental Testing Service credits.
I know, I had to de-ice yesterday. Let's see if it pops up. There it is. Again, thank you. Well, I always appreciate the opportunity to come and speak. So again, Tony asked for specifics on California. I just wanted to start by saying Tony requested and credits provided our occupational analysis, which we just did recently a year ago in collaboration with REB. So we look forward to working if Heidi or you need any information on our occupational analysis, and also our technical reports are always public. So none of that, you don't even have to be a member. We just put that on our website, that kind of information. But Tony, if you need anything for Heidi that we haven't provided you, please let us know.
Will do. Thank you.
Yep. Again, this is partially a report. When our hygiene exam review committee meets, we meet in July. And the crux of our exam season happens January through June, because those are the recent graduates. So some of the statistics I'm going to provide for 2019 are through June. And I just want to remind, we've said this before, and Kelly alluded to this, what we know nationally, regardless of what testing agency, is generally in dentistry and dental hygiene, we have about 2 to 3% of all graduates who never can pass a clinical licensure exam. So that is the target group. Even though they've been issued a degree in dentistry or a degree in dental hygiene, what we know, gathering all of our information, is there's about 2 to 3 that never do achieve licensure. With regard to our overall pool, at this point in the year, we had tested nearly 2,000 candidates. And what you're seeing here is 94.8%. This is initial attempts only. We pulled out any reattempt. So this is on the first attempt. 94.8% are successful on their first attempt. What I also did for the exam review committee is we broke out the 5.2% that were unsuccessful. As Michelle just said, 1.4% of those never qualified a patient. Now, they are unsuccessful, because if you can't qualify a patient, you still are considered unsuccessful. But we want to try to limit that as much as possible. So ultimately, those that did qualify a patient and sat for the exam, 3.8 were unsuccessful on their initial attempt. Now, what we implemented this last year was on-site retakes. So if somebody is unsuccessful, we do half-day groups. So let's just say somebody tests on a Friday afternoon. Usually within 30 minutes of completing their exam, they log into their credits portal, which is a private ID number, and they can see if they passed or not. Of course, they get all the exam information when they log in. If they were unsuccessful, they have the opportunity to retake. Now, this last year, we did charge a retake fee. In 2020, there will be no retake fee. So what I'm getting at is we found there were so few people, ultimately, it was more of a headache to collect money, then we were already on site, we were already there, so it's a no fee situation. Now, this slide, if you can follow me on the top line, what I gathered here on the retake summary is out of 1,651 total candidates, 63, so we're not using percentages, we're just using numbers, 63 were unsuccessful, 23 did not qualify a patient, so that did leave 86 candidates. Now, this is not just California, this is nationally, but 86 were eligible for a retake. Of that, 66, go to the next line, of the 86, 66 chose to retake. What we found was of the 20 that chose not to retake, generally they had a very, very low score. And my guess is, just common sense, they didn't feel ready. Okay, so of the 66, then you drop down to the next line, 57 of those were successful. 5 who seated a patient were unsuccessful, and 4 did not qualify a patient. So they were still unsuccessful. But I think this was, being our first year with on-site retakes, this was information we really were, anxious to gather. So what we found, and Kelly alluded to this, is sometimes it was perhaps they just had a more difficult patient than they should have the first time. For whatever reason, they regrouped, and most of those candidates did very well. So now for California, now I'm gonna focus back on this in a minute, but I just wanted to pop it up here right now. So the overall national average for passing, as I just mentioned earlier, was 94.2%. Now that was in 2018. The 94.8 is for 2019. So we have been within a percentage point for 2018 and 2019. What you get in California, being a member state of credits, is we break it out for you by school. Now, I'm not obviously disclosing which schools these are, but each school gets a report. You get a report that you can break out by school
how each school is doing. So I just flashed up 11 schools here, and you can see on their first time attempt, this was not any retakes, those are the results. And the mean score nationally is 89.35. California tends to perform very well. That's basically the bottom line. Are there any questions on this slide? I'll regroup.
Is there a reason why that
You know, I did. Thank you, Susan. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth one down is actually a school that tested or tested at or with the school that was listed last. Those two schools, those students were tested together. So that was the same exam team. So I just think, I can't believe you recognize that, but that was a mental note to me to bring that up, that was not a standalone school that you might be able to attribute to the examiners. Do you see what I'm saying? So the school that was fourth down had 100% pass, but there was another school, again, Tony is given the school codes, so you would know exactly which school we're talking about. It's a confidential list, obviously, but as a member board, you are provided that. And just so you know, each program gets this report. So those schools can analyze their students compared to other students. Now, they don't know the secret code for any other schools. They just know their code. And I believe this is the kind of information they like to have for accreditation. So I will come back very quickly and revisit that, but I knew probably that was a question you had immediately. Just to remind, in case there's any newer members, credits basically has been a part of your life since the get-go. But it was in 2013 that you voted as a committee in those days to accept credits. You joined credits as a member state in 2014, and we have continued to administer exams here since. This is a map showing the states that currently accept credits for initial licensure. If anybody here has any influence on Nevada, we would greatly appreciate that. As you guys know, you're a state board. Every state board gets to make these decisions. We just work for, and here what I wanted to show you, of the states that accept credits, many of them are not member states of credits. And so these are the 20 states that are member states, and you can see that California, Hygiene, I would not know if the California Dental Board would like to join credits. That would be wonderful. But if they did, they would have their own seat, as the California Dental Hygiene would have their own full block seat. So those are the states that have a say in what our exam looks like. So just so you know, right now, Michelle represents you on the credit steering committee. And I'm just going to back up. If I can. We have one person from each state that represents their state. So there's 20 members on our steering committee, which is another word for our board. And then you elected Nikki to serve on our Hygiene ERC. I will say, Nikki, your term is done coming up this year, so let me talk about those two positions. The steering member has to be a seated board member. So the steering member would be one of you guys. It could be your executive officer. It could be a consumer member. It doesn't matter. All the bylaws say is that it has to be a voting member on your sitting board.
And what is ERC?
Exam Review Committee. Thank you for asking. I apologize. Now, the Exam Review Committee is obviously a subcommittee that looks at the statistics. Some of the statistics and pie charts I just showed you are what we present every year in July, so we can decide if we need to make any changes and that sort of thing. So for instance, we developed recently a local anesthesia exam, and Nikki was on that subcommittee. And so she had input in that and whatever assignments we give to that committee. Now the ERC member does not have to be a sitting board member. That could be somebody you elect or have represent you. I'm showing you some examiner names that are listed before. For instance, Lori DeCaro is not a sitting board member, but she has now been a credits examiner for a couple years. If she had an interest, and the reason I say this is because Tony, I think there's been issues with travel, and that you can't always fund your travel. And maybe Lori, because credits pays for everything. But I guess in California, there's some issue with traveling out of state. Is this? Correct. Yes.
In the past, there has been heavy restriction on out-of-state travel. You submit your request, and the requests usually go all the way up to the governor's office for approval. With the new administration, we haven't tried to request out-of-state travel, so the parameters for it may be changed. So it's something that we can definitely research and look into.
And not a concern, because we still could do a tele. For instance, Michelle, when you have to have a sitting board member, you could teleconference in, so it wouldn't necessarily, you'd still be a part of the meeting. Sometimes the exam review committee, as maybe Nikki could share, it's a very hands-on committee. It's a small working group, it's hard working group. To do it by teleconference would probably not be ideal. So my point is, if you, Nikki, want to continue, you would just let us know. If you elect or nominate somebody else to be part of the exam review committee, it's nothing you have to decide today. You just have to let Tony know, and Tony lets us know, and it's a done deal. But if travel was an issue, you can nominate any of these people to be part of that system. So again, these are some of the schools that we've had history with in California. We greatly appreciate. You've got some great schools. Now, this is the report that is 2018, and I apologize, 2019 won't be released until right after the first of the year, because we need to complete a bunch of exams in December to actually issue the what's called schools report. But this is the kind of analysis. It's about a 30-page document, and every school that tests with credits, the program director gets this, as well as the state of California. So Tony gets a copy of this. And just the first page, you can see the program code on the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Perhaps a school in California is, let's pick number 8, because they did really well. The program director is told their secret code, but nobody else knows that code. Now, Tony would have access to the secret codes, and you would know. Now, this is the exact slide I showed previously. I just pulled from the secret codes all the California schools that had more than at least 5 candidates testing in any given season. Now, this is another report that California gets, as well as the program director, but it breaks it down by category of the exam. I know it's tiny print. I redacted the names, but you as a board, you actually get the candidate's name, and you get exact information on how they performed on the exam. For instance, in tissue management, if anybody did have a critical failure in tissue management, which I know is a gross, an issue in your statute, you would know that from this report. You also ask it on your application, which is double check, which is great. So that's the statistical information. I thought perhaps to give you an update. Obviously, in the world of clinical licensure exams, there's a lot going on, and the goal is to possibly move towards exams that are less patient-based or perhaps more integrated in the candidate's school. Our dental exam is moving towards steering voted to move it almost to a completely non-patient based, and they're working on that. And hygiene is doing the same thing. Of course, even if we hypothetically came up with an exam, we would have to get all of our state boards' approval on this, but that's where you're steering, and Michelle serves on that, and then Hygiene Exam Review Committee, they could report back to you on the progress we're making in that area. So these were just some other models, and you already know about the California portfolio model, but clearly lots of energy going into that. And just quickly, I wanted to mention For 2020, we did this at annual meeting, a quick report, and this is my only slide because we have no changes to the credits exam in 2020. We have no changes, I should say, to content scoring and criteria. We always make changes, updates on wording in the manual. We clarified some things on local anesthesia record keeping, oral assessment, but for what I think this board cares about is the content, scoring, and criteria. There were no changes for 2020. And I just wanted to thank you. The last time I was here, I mentioned that I thought it was important that perhaps you add a question to your application, and question number 17 nailed it. Have you failed 3 or more clinical examinations? And by adding that to your examination, it helps us. We credits at the bottom, I know you can't read it very well. We ask the candidates to report if they've failed any other exam. But most of our states, including you, have a requirement that if you've been unsuccessful 3 times, before you can take another exam, you have to have remediation or you have to have approval from a board. And so by adding that one question to your application, I think you've really, and then your other thought earlier today about fraudulent or lying, I guess, being dishonest. If somebody were dishonest with this, that's what we have to do is trust that they're being, but if you don't ask the question, they could squirt around it. But thank you for adding that to your application. Just so you know, we did add a restorative auxiliary examination. Many of your surrounding states, not you, but further north, they require a restorative exam for expanded duties and also a local anesthesia exam. So this is just a quick picture. That would be me. During the candidates for the local anesthesia exam, we introduced technology where the candidate wears a action camera on their forehead, and then a proctor who is not grading them, which would have been me in this picture. With the examiners grade from home, and everything's uploaded, and they have 2 different views, and that's the clinical part of the local anesthesia exam. So that was just an update on some new changes. So with that, obviously, thank you very, very much again for having me. Is there any questions?
Any questions from members of the board? I have a clarifying question on the ERC and the steering committee representatives from our board. Those are elected by us or by you?
By you. You tell us. You forward the names to us. It's totally your decision. But by being a member state, we appreciate that you obviously do that because that's your voice. And I think that's what you wanted. So, and you've been well represented. And that doesn't have to change. But if it did, Nikki's current term, and I think she's going to share. Are you?
Yes, I would definitely recommend to Tony to pick another board member to serve on the ERC, and especially with me no longer being in education, even though, I mean, it doesn't matter. But I do think that it would be better served by one of our other members.
And again, no rush. We don't meet again until July. So if we could get a name, if you can't make it, you do have, at the end of this term, it would just be slipping somebody in and then they'd take over.
Are there any other comments from members of the board? Questions? What about members of the public?
Noel?
I just wanted to see if you know how many people took your board during 2019 so far.
I believe it was so far.
Yeah. Oh,
just over 300.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good question. One more thing, Tony often gets requests from, I believe, hygienists in California about how to become an examiner. And thank you for forwarding that, but I do want you to know that credits do not recruit examiners. We get the names from you. For instance, this was prior to Tony, but Lori Hubble moved, and you guys moved, that Lori not Lori. Who am I thinking? Yeah. Yeah, Lori DeCaro. You moved her name and recommended her, and right now, you saw the list. We really have our quota. We try to keep our examiners per state based on the number of candidates. So right now, even when Tony forwards a name or you forward a name to us, we would never accept an examiner for credits unless you've already said, in your opinion, they are in good standing, they have no discipline, that sort of thing. You would move those to us. And the examiners you currently have, they will share with you that we do examiner profiles, they are graded, they get reports on how they do when we talked about lenient and maybe perhaps more critical. Every examiner gets that report, and while it's all confidential, I can share with you that nobody from California has ever received a disciplinary letter who examines for California. They're doing very well.
And are those people that are selected for examiners, those are referred by the executive officer?
Yes, and or this board as a whole. So it's your decision if you wanted to direct Tony to say, I think we need to look at these names before you send them to Kim. If you direct him to do that and he vets them first, we leave that up to you as a board, how you want to do that.
Do we have terms? Do they have terms?
They do not. As long as they're in good standing, generally they stay on. If for some reason you ever told us you wanted us to remove an examiner that was a California, we would do that. That is also your prerogative.
Any other questions? Members of the board? Members of the public? Hearing none, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for being here today. Before we go into closed session, we do have a little ceremony that we'd like to conduct, and that is for, we talked about our members who are completing their recent term, and we are hopeful that they will be back, but in the meantime, they served wonderfully for the last 4 years, so we have a really nice, already framed, but it's frameable, already framed certificate of appreciation for Michelle and Etzelyn and Noel and Sandy. And they read, and they look really nice, as you can see. It has the California Department of Consumer Affairs up here, and then it says Certificate of Appreciation presented by the Dental Hygiene Board of California to, in this case, Dr. Michelle Hurlbut, RDH educator, in recognition of your dedication, commitment, and invaluable service as an original board member, president, and chair of numerous subcommittees in the protection of consumers of dental hygiene services. You served on the board from October 21st, 2009, reappointed twice on August 23rd, 2012, and January 1st, 2016, until end of term. And it's signed by me, but it has beautiful logo of the DCA and the Great Seal of California, and then our own DHPC. So what I'd like you to do, Michelle, is come up and stand here while we read the others and hold your little certificate, and then we're going to do a picture.
Michelle, just a comment. They barely had enough room to fit everything that you've done for this board on that certificate, so much appreciated.
That's very nice. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Well, you've been a great asset. We then have, and I guess I need to put this, okay, we have presented by the Dental Hygiene Board of California to Joyce Noel Kelsch, RDHAP. And it says, in recognition of your dedication, commitment, and invaluable service as a board member in the protection of consumers of dental hygiene services, you served on the board from August 23rd, 2012, reappointed once on January 1st, 2016, and as president from January 1st, 2016 until December 31st, 2017. So come on up. And Noel is my assigned professional as a public member, and I have to say, I really appreciate the ability to be able to talk to her and talk very frankly and kind of learn a little bit more about the profession. So thank you. We then have Etzelyn Pujol. And Etzelyn, this is in recognition of your dedication, commitment, and invaluable service as a board member in the protection of consumers of dental hygiene services. You served on the board from January 25th, 2016 until the end of the term, December 31st, 2019. And as secretary from January 1st, 2019 until December 31st, 2019. And then last but not least, we have Sandra Klein. In recognition of your dedication, commitment, and invaluable service as a board member in the protection of consumers of dental hygiene services, you served on the board from October 25th, 2015, and reappointed once on January 1st, 2016, until the end of the term, December 31st, 2019. And so now, if we could have a photo here. Yeah, go that way. Yeah, you can. Okay. These people are stars, you know. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile. This way. Collectively, how many years are we talking about? We're talking about a lot of years. So that's awesome.
One more.
And
Ready?
want to make sure we got it.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much. What an honor it has been to serve amongst you. And now we will adjourn for closed session. Thank you so much for being with us here today. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.